Thornton, LLP. Your participation is encouraged during this webinar. You may post questions or share your comments at any time during the session in the Q&A box located on your computer screen. Questions will be addressed as time permits. For audio, dial 844-522-4080, conference code 925596#, guest pin 5618. If you have problems hearing the presentation, you may comment in the Q&A box and our staff will reply as soon as possible. In order to receive CPE credit for your attendance for this session, you must submit checkpoints that will appear on your computer screen during the session and complete the online evaluation. Also, please be advised that this session is being recorded. It is my pleasure to welcome today's speakers from Grant Thornton, LLP. Stephen Tomei is the Principal of a Health System Transaction Leader. Mr. Tomei has more than 20 years of experience working with large integrated systems, academic medical centers, community physician practices. As a healthcare leader of Grant Thornton's Business Risk Advisory Services practice, he has led a range of engagements assisting health systems and regulators with managing and understanding risks and engagements related to transactions, strategic and capital planning, physician relationships, and clinically integrated networks, compliance, and more. Lance Beater is partner health care and life sciences diligence with Grant Thornton. Mr. Beater is a partner in our transaction services practice and co-leads the healthcare and life sciences transaction services practice and has over 23 years of professional services within large professional service organizations. His primary experience is serving clients at all facets of the healthcare and life sciences industry. Then we have our final speaker, Mr. Stephen Sparks, is partner of IT separation integration for Grant Thornton. Mr. Spark leads the IT integration separation practice within digital transformation. He has 25 plus years career includes architecting and delivering large-scale systems and integration programs as clients acquire organizations. With that, Mr. Tomei, I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on what part of the country you're in. Thank you for joining us today. I think we all know that we've witnessed a lot of transactions and M&A activity in healthcare, no matter where you reside in the healthcare industry. And so talking about this topic today, I think it's kind of an ever-timely topic just because the amount of M&A activity we've experienced over the last several years, that pace continues, and I think we'd all agree it will continue on into the future. So along with myself, Lance Beater and Stephen Sparks, we'd like to say welcome. And one thing I would encourage is that as we are going through this presentation, please submit questions. We'll stop periodically to respond to them. And, our hope is that by submitting questions as we go and responding as we go, we'll make it more interactive and hopefully make our questions a little more timely in terms of how they fit into the presentation. So in terms of what we want to talk to you about today, we will begin by talking about the healthcare transaction landscape. We'll talk about it both from the perspective of not-for-profit health systems. We'll talk about it from the perspective of physician groups, and we'll also bring in the perspective of for-profit money, either through PE firms or other private investment vehicles. All of those interests and all of that money and all of those investments have a confluence in the industry, and so I think understanding them more holistically is important to understanding where healthcare is headed. We'll also talk about the transaction life cycle and try to break down what's involved in transactions into the pieces and parts. So we'll walk through the deal pieces, through the due diligence process. We'll help you think through day one readiness. So as you take on an acquisition, there's a little bit of the dog catching the car. How do you be ready for day one? And then longer than day one, how do you integrate over time? So we'll talk about integration as well. And then we'll also introduce some lessons learned. And throughout this conversation, I hope we'll be able to add some examples from observations in the market, either working with clients, just noting transactions in various parts of the country that we've probably all seen in the media, et cetera. So that's really the agenda for today. And because we all are getting CPE credit for this, I do want to start off by focusing on the session's objectives. Really what we're hoping to leave you with a greater knowledge than you arrive to the WebEx is an understanding of, as you're doing transactions, how do you get the value out of the transaction that you were hoping for? So we can certainly always go through this. A transaction as an academic exercise, is something that's put on our plate by somebody else, as something that we have to do in the course of our jobs. But let's also think about it. And if we're going to do it, let's do it right. Let's try to find those value points and deliver on that value. So with that said, with the agenda and the session objectives stated and behind us, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Lance Beater, who's going to talk about the different pieces and parts of the transaction life cycle. And Lance, if you want to take over the mic, I think Stephen and I will probably jump in with comments and questions along the way ourselves, but I'll turn it over to you, Lance.
Thanks, Stephen. So I just a quick background in terms of the focus of what I do within Grant Thornton in the transaction side of healthcare investing is working predominantly with financial investors, and those are investors primarily from private equity or family offices or larger corporations that are investing into healthcare. And you know, the way in which they are investing is using their strategic objectives as the guiding principle, and how they measure success is really determined based on what those strategies are that they are attempting to achieve. And at the highest level of private equity investing is to maximize returns in terms of their investing within a sector within healthcare, unlike the not-for-profit healthcare sector. Looking at the slide specifically, in terms of the life cycle of a business, and it's not necessarily only the transaction, but the way in which we see the transaction landscape or the life cycle is almost like a rainbow fashion. And in this slide, you can see in the way we present and the way in which we do different services within that position within the life cycle. So in terms of the very high level understanding of a transaction, depending on a buyer's strategy on what they're looking to achieve, they'll identify a target, and they will then court the target in terms of evaluating the strategic fit. What are the benefits of the acquiring target and the acquirer coming together, and what is the value of the combined business? If there is a strategic initiative and an objective met, and that could be, primarily focused on financial returns, or looking at the value in which they could provide a high quality of service to a population or a specific underserved market, they will engage with that target company and sign an LOI. So the LOI is the commitment where a buyer and a seller would engage in a potential transaction after a certain amount of diligence has been provided. But there's certainly a fair amount of work that goes in before a LOI is executed. And for those that are not sure what an LOI is, an LOI is a letter of intent. It's really a affirmation of two parties committing to each other that, barring any unforeseen circumstances through diligence, they would consummate the transaction. But before you get to the LOI point, there is pre-LOI effort that's exerted. And that's sourcing of deals, identifying the potential acquisition targets that exist, where they're based, and if a strategic objective would be met by acquiring that specific target. Through the diligence process, which is part of the process initiated after the LOI is signed, you have a firm like ourselves, which would be engaged to perform a number of different procedures around due diligence. And we've categorized those at a high level as operational due diligence functions. And those include primarily financial, tax. There is certainly operational, commercial diligence. There's technology diligence, which Steve Sparks would speak to in a moment. And then there is the completion of that effort or workflow that goes into validating the assumptions that the buyer was assuming would be achieved by that acquisition. After that diligence process is complete, obviously there's legal processes that have to be completed in terms of documenting a sale and purchase agreement, and that gets executed, and that consummates a transaction. So after that contract or the sale and purchase agreement has been executed, you enter into the phase of what do you do now that you have consummated a transaction. And that engages into the post-close or post-acquisition period, where the value extraction of the two parties coming together would have to be determined, and that's really where the success of the initial part of courting that particular transaction or that entity is extracted from the transaction. And that really highlights the emphasis of this session, is to identify how do you extract the value of doing the transaction. Because up till that point, no value is being extracted yet. It's all theoretical. In terms of evaluating the target, in terms of going through diligence, in terms of executing and legally binding and consummating the transaction. From that point forward is where the value gets extracted. And that's really where we'd want to focus on in terms of, some of those values that we identified during diligence and how those are really categorized for action on day one. At this point, I think from the financial perspective, which I really focus on, and we'll come back to that in a moment, but maybe a word from Steven Sparks on the IT technology side. As you can imagine, there's a fair amount of focus and effort that has to be exerted on the technology side. And maybe, Steve, if you want to just give a voiceover in terms of the focus that you have in technology.
Sure, thanks, Lance. So if you see on this slide, it's slide number 6, the transaction lifecycle itself, you look at, this is kind of the typical approach that would happen with respect to an acquisition or really the transaction as a whole. I mean, there's various points that sometimes we get involved in, and in some cases they may not necessarily be from the very beginning. It may be in the midst of different areas. So, we will look at things in terms of how far along they are with respect to this life cycle itself. And there's varying degrees of focus as you go forward with the life cycle. And from an IT perspective, when I've looked at this, and we do a lot of work with both private equity firms as well as what we call strategic buyers, in other words, other companies buying another company, the focus will change as you go through this life cycle. So as an example, to kind of put some reality to the life cycle itself, in the pre-LOI section, the thing that we're seeing is, that's very early stage. So you want to be on, you want to do things that are really at a very high level in terms of where there could be some risks. And then as you go forward and as you get very serious around doing the transaction and understanding what the issues are with respect to IT, then you can actually dive into more of the details of what the what the issues are from an IT perspective as well. And then you just keep peeling back the layers of the onion, to borrow the analogy, so you can really get down to what the core of what IT is doing for you. And from our perspective, we just have a look at it in terms of every time you go a little bit closer to the final deal signing, you want to identify what those risks are and how to move forward with it. So I know Stephen has a comment around the life cycle, given that he's done these multiple times, as well as all of us have, and we can kind of get into some additional kind of reality of what happens with respect to these transactions.
Yeah, I think that it's important as you look at the life cycle and you can think about these different stages. It really helps you plan out what to do when, as you're moving through a transaction, and certainly, even as you're digging into IT, as Steve was talking about, or really any of the operational areas that you'll be assuming or taking over, or any other aspects of the transaction, by being able to visualize and think through with the end in mind, where you're headed with the transaction through the life cycle, then you can begin to plan ahead and not have the tail wagging the dog, so to speak, but you can be you can be in control, because you're expecting what comes next. You're aligning your resources appropriately as you go, and you can organize your team effectively. And it's both internal members of your team or any external advisors that you'd be hiring. So generally, as you're thinking through what you can get done, early is often better. Sometimes you have to wait for the right level of information to be shared, so that if you're dealing with competitively sensitive information, it's going to be a little bit later in the process when you're able to look at it. And what you really need to do is balance planning and investment, investing earlier in the process against your level of certainty that the deal will happen. So if you're 90% sure the deal is going to go through, you don't see many obstacles, you can start things like integration planning a lot sooner. And then if you're more worried about it, either because of regulatory approvals or just the nature of the negotiations, then oftentimes you're put in a position where you have to delay some of the investments and the work that you do until you have a higher degree of certainty. But the overall message here is that by understanding the entirety of the life cycle, it just helps you plan more effectively, so that you're in control throughout that process and you're happier with the value that you get on the back end.
So yeah, with that background, talking about the life cycles we see at Grant Thornton, and I think there's no understatement of the level of importance of planning in any transaction. I think from experience, unfortunately, where deals do fail, it's a function of representation of a seller, that the seller may be further along and more prepared to do a transaction, and committing to move at a faster pace, or just an indication of how hot and attractive the healthcare sector is that it is a seller's market. and sellers are looking to maximize their valuation, and buyers are, very cautious right now to ensure that they are paying a very attractive multiple, but on real earnings. So at the moment now, in terms of what we've seen in the market, buyers are not reluctant to pay a fair value, but they want to be paying value for companies and providers where value has been attributed to the performance of that practice. One of the questions which came through, and this applies to the next slide that we've presented, is looking at on the for-profit side of healthcare, and this is often discussed at different conferences that I attend around the country in terms of evaluating which sector in healthcare is attractive, which is the next sector, and I would say that to state some of the obvious sectors, and some of you on the presentation may have heard this before, but behavioral is a sector that's still getting a lot of attention, and that's a function of the reimbursement valuations and attractiveness in populations getting access to reimbursement, especially around ABA. Another sector that's certainly getting a lot of attention again is home health care. 6-7 years ago, home health care was a very attractive subsector within healthcare, and what we've now seen in the last 12 to 18 months is that unskilled or skilled or hospice or home nursing has become a very attractive space, especially as there's more state-managed Medicaid expansion, and that's driving some of the attractiveness in the home health care space. The single specialties that are still attractive and still get recognized at every conference is the orthopedics, dermatology, urology, gastro. I would say that still orthopedics definitely gets a prime position in terms of attractiveness. But from what we've been hearing, I think one of the consensus is that it's a little bit more of a challenging environment to transact in that space right now, because it's being so overtraded that multiples have driven up valuations to a level that are uncomfortable. So it is also an indication that some of the consolidation attributes to what private equity attempts to achieve is really a consolidator of volume and practices has been achieved. So other subsectors that still have gone through consolidation for many years, even decades, and a subsector like dentistry has been consolidating, as I said, for decades. It is still an attractive subsector for its retail aspect. So one of the things that you have to consider as well that drives the investment thesis is the ability to retail a healthcare service like urgent care, another subsector that's very attractive. Just focusing on the slide that's being presented on your screens right now, slide 7, in terms of the breakdown of the healthcare ecosystem between let's put it into the category of hospital systems, but most of them being not-for-profit, and private capital and where it's sourced. And Stephen can speak probably at length around the not-for-profit activity and the mergers and acquisitions that are going on in that space. But one of the phenomenons that health systems are contending with is the consolidation and the growth that private capital or private equity is committing to the consolidation of healthcare services. I saw an article last week that one of the top 10 largest home healthcare companies which transacted in the last year was a consolidation with Blue Wolf Capital that consolidated Great Lakes Caring and Jordan Home Healthcare to $1 billion home healthcare company. And that certainly getting the attention of not-for-profit health systems. Private equity is certainly focused on certain subsectors, as I've mentioned, and I think the challenge that hospital systems are facing is making sure that their continuum of care from the acute setting to the post-acute setting with that patient is captured within that health system. So if you look at, for example, urgent care, we've seen a number of urgent care practices, large groups across the country that have grown significantly, and they've had their fair share of challenges along the way with reimbursement and utilization and efficiencies, and there's a lot of work that goes into evaluating and benchmarking operational diligence metrics through diligence that is executed and enhanced post-diligence or post-acquisition that drives some of the value extraction out of the transaction. The other point that I wanted to make with how health systems and private equity or private capital is co-investing or co-supporting are the relationships around, say, for example, urgent care, where urgent care is contracting through private equity consortiums with health systems to provide an extension of post-acute service or even an entry feeder system into health systems through an expanded urgent care network that are co-branded with health systems and are, co-invested under a joint venture model with private equity. And Stephen, I don't know if that's an area that maybe you want to comment on a little further in some of the relationships that you've seen between health systems and private capital.
Sure. So, I think one old example of where a private entity and not-for-profit entities have worked together well. It's just if you look at a really large orthopedic group in Philadelphia called the Rothman Institute, they employ, certainly in the three figures of orthopedists. They cover multiple counties in southeast Pennsylvania. They extend into southern New Jersey and into northern Delaware. While they weren't created by PE money, I think it gives a view of what some of these PE roll-ups can start to, to do and how they play in the market. So that, a place like the Rothman Institute certainly has strong relationships with a few different health systems, and a lot of their physicians have privileges at those health systems. They also own and operate their own specialty hospitals and ambulatory surgery sites, and they have their own brand out in the market. So all of those things together, create. I think if you went back into the 90s or the early 2000s and you think about physician practice management companies, this is an instance of success that as PE firms and other private funding sources, when they invest in these roll-ups of physician practices, this is the kind of thing that they can create. They'll own their own slice or segment of the continuum of care. So it is interesting that when you look at the diagram, it's a very obviously a simple diagram to fit onto a page of the healthcare ecosystem. On the inpatient side, generally hospitals are there alone. There are certainly some acute care hospitals left over that are for-profit and maybe physician-run from the days when that was legal, and then there are the HCAs of the world that are competing in that space. But a lot of, I think as you look at the acute care, the inpatient acute care market, that's focusing more and more on tertiary as lower acuity services move to outpatient. And as outpatient is the area of growth in healthcare, then it creates a really interesting dynamic and environment where not-for-profit money and for-profit money will intersect, compete, and sometimes collaborate. So on the not-for-profit side, consolidation's going on all over the country. There's a question of how big is big enough. Is it related to the size of an executive's ego? Is it related to the size that you need, the platform that you need for population health? Do you need size for economies of scale related to IT investment or just access to capital? It's really hard to say exactly where this will end in terms of how big is big enough. But we have seen growth with academic health systems crossing state lines that are, and I'll say crossing state lines where they're not small states, so that some systems like UPMC has just moved into Maryland. We've seen some interregional mergers and acquisitions among Catholic organizations. We're seeing more and more of large health systems moving on beyond their initial metropolitan area boundaries, becoming multi-metropolitan area types of providers. So in that sense, I think we see the healthcare the transaction landscape continuing. We, as much as we see the activity at the acute care level, there is a much more competitive segment in the outpatient for in all the areas that Lance described. So I think it's important to understand this landscape, both as you're contemplating your own transactions, but also as you're just preparing yourself for what's ahead, because when transactions come to your market, there's usually a domino effect, and the pace and the inertia kind of becomes its own force. So it often happens that as integration happens in a market, the first few dominoes fall, and it isn't too many years later, usually a fairly short period of time, where you'll see health systems consolidated down to 2 or 3 players. So with that backdrop, I think that it might be interesting to move ahead to begin to talk about the how we've talked about the life cycle of the transaction. We've talked about what's going on in the market. Then let's get to what the topic of the presentation was about, which is how do you get the value out of your transaction? And so for those of you, hopefully you all have moved ahead to the integration POV slide, and we're showing page 8. I think this slide does a good job at breaking down where transactions go wrong is one way to look at it, or also just breaking it down into a couple of central questions, so that as you're planning and thinking about your transaction, that you're asking the right questions internally for what you're trying to get out of it, but B, I think it helps create an organizational check on whether you're really ready to embrace and go forward with the transaction. So if you look in the first column, where I think everything is checked and everything's going right, and you're trying to optimize conditions for success, you really have your vision, your value, your operating model, and sort of a knowledge of your risk environment all lined up. And so your organization has the clarity of purpose, you're ready to focus on the right priorities in terms of where value will come from, and there's a good understanding of what the deal thesis is all about throughout the organization. You're able to plan for growth and achieve the deal thesis just by understanding how the operating model will change and need to be leveraged to drive the value of the transaction. And then managing the risks could range from anything from keeping the deal on track and certain risks that you manage during the negotiation process, all the way through to various IT risks that I think Stephen will talk about later, to the challenge of retaining your doctors or other risks that can throw the main purpose of why you did the deal off track. But when any one of these elements is missing, then it turns out that you'll end up suboptimizing the original purpose of why you did the transaction. If you're not able to state a vision for why you're doing pursuing M&A or doing a specific deal, if it's only known at the top levels, or even it hasn't, that the deal's presented itself. Sometimes organizations move ahead without a clear understanding of why, other than they feel like they have to act now. Without that vision, it creates confusion, and that confusion will trickle down into your organization. Some of it just leads to some general griping, but it also that confusion makes it hard for various levels of leadership, from VPs to directors to managers, to rally around the true purpose of the transaction. So that confusion becomes a leakage point. If there is an understanding of the vision, but there isn't really a strong articulation of the value proposition, down into the level of what are the value drivers, what creates the synergies, are you going to grow, are you going to reduce costs, whatever those drivers tend to be, without a focus on the value and what those specific drivers are, you'll end up with a diluted value proposition, because a lot of good intentions, a lack of focus leads to a lack of ability to implement and execute. So again, you have value leakage just because you're missing a key component of understanding the full life cycle, or the full reason for why you're doing the transaction. If you can't understand the transaction from an operating model level, it makes it very hard to implement. People will try to understand. They kind of get why you're doing the transaction. They get that there's some value in there and why. They don't really understand, without a clearly articulated operating model, they don't really understand how their role in the organization fits into the transaction. And so there's a lot of frustration, and it usually leads to rework. It leads to duplication of efforts, leads to competing efforts, and so you end up with a frustrated organization that sees a better horizon but doesn't quite know how to get there. And if you don't manage the risk as you're going through a transaction, then you can have certain things kind of get out of hand a little bit, in terms of if you're losing positions, if costs are spiraling out of control, if you run into regulatory problems that delay you for a certain period of time that's unexpected, it becomes a little bit of a free-for-all. And so that chaos obviously becomes another point of value leakage. So as we go through the rest of our presentation today, we'll talk about these 4 areas, and we'll talk about them as a matter of going through the life cycle, so that for all of you on the phone participating in transactions, you'll be able to hopefully get the most out of your transaction in terms of value. Moving ahead to page 9, I think that this diagram does a nice job of showing. Trying to move the slides ahead. Hopefully, it's moved ahead for all of you. It does a nice job of showing how you can value out of the deal in the most optimal way, and if you don't, where do you end up? If you run afoul of those questions on the previous page, a lot of times what you end up with is that wandering line. We've done a transaction, we work at it a little bit. Sometimes we're serious about implementation, sometimes we're not. And the value line kind of wanders around for a couple of years, and you don't really end up arriving at where you'd like to be. Typical deals where there is more planning, people are trying to be smart and somewhat disciplined about how they approach the deals. They'll have a mid-level full of value. They won't get everything out of the deal that they're hoping for. They'll get there over time. They probably will get there more slowly. But really, if you want to be on the higher value plane, you can get there by, I think, through the excellent organization we talked about across the different areas we've addressed so far. So the attributes of successful acquirers, they make investments when they need to. They don't think that recognize that you don't always get value for free, and so you make investments early and often where it's necessary, whether that is in enabling technologies, it might be in adding resources so that you're not expecting everybody with day jobs to then turn into implementers. It's pulling the right advisors at the right time that you need them. It's really making sure that you are making the investments so that you're not holding back. You're not holding back the promise of the deal. You're providing the ingredients that need to be there for it to be successful. In terms of leveraging leading practices, generally, I think we're going to talk about a number of those as we go through this presentation, but it's executing efficiently and smartly as you're going through the diligence process, being thorough and understanding where the risks are. It's thinking through thoughtfully how you execute the deal in terms of terms and agreement. It also involves having strong plans for day one readiness and integration. And then lastly, I think that this is often an area that's missed as I watch clients or really any health organizations in the market tackle M&A work. It's being able to if you don't measure something, a lot of times it doesn't go as well as when you do. By having metrics and measuring what your expectations are, by measuring your progress, by having disciplined project management that measures where you are against plan, all of those things help you achieve the goals that you set out for in kind of the reasonable timeline that you're expecting. So those attributes are just very important to keep in mind as you're getting started in planning your transaction, the project management, and having really detailed integration plans that focus very tightly along the lines of what you think the value drivers are. So you're prioritizing high value items over medium over low. Those are really important attributes for getting into that that upper shaded area of the value journey with the deal.
And Stephen, this is Steve. I wanted to throw in a comment on that, on the attributes of successful acquirers. I work a lot with private equity, and one of the things that they're very laser focused on, because their holding period for some companies is anywhere from 5 to 7 years, and they look at something very specifically around how is that going to move the needle by, for every dollar I'm investing in this company, and am I going to get $7 on a return in 5 to 7 years? I mean, my clients have specifically said that, and that comes very important from an IT perspective, because candidly, there's some IT projects when they after they've acquired the company, they say, look, those IT projects are really of no value to us in 7 years, so we're not going to do it. And so they're going to be, and they'll shift the focus around where those capital investments are going to be. And I think that's something to keep in the back of your minds as you look at your targets and you look at acquisitions. That it's very highly. You almost have to have a really hard discipline, to really move forward in this around saying we're going to focus on only those things that are really going to be of value to what we're doing. And I think PE sometimes tends to do that quite a bit. So, Stephen, I'll turn it back over to you. I know you want to jump into the next area here on kind of deal thesis and deal strategy. Stephen, if you want to go ahead. Stephen.
And thanks, Steve. In terms of trying to think about leading practices and breaking down the different aspects or elements of a transaction into buckets that you can focus on, I think this page does a nice job of doing it in a somewhat sequential fashion. So defining the deal thesis is important up front. It begins to say why you're doing it. It will help to alleviate the chaos or the angst or the confusion that we talked about in a previous slide. It helps to organize your organization around the main value points, and it really, whether it's a single transaction or a transaction that's occurring in a series of transactions, it really explains why your organization should move forward with transactions, what you're trying to get out of it, what the value drivers are. Moving to the next part, this is where I think some of the discipline starts to arrive. So in a deal thesis, it's very conceptual. It's words. It's partly it's an elevator speech, partly it's a short explanation of what you're trying to accomplish with the transaction. But moving from that conceptual description into the planning and forecasting is really where you start to understand the value from a little bit more of a math perspective. The planning and forecasting become the math behind the thesis. They'll incorporate the assumptions and value drivers to create the pro formas. And those assumptions and value drivers that you're putting into the pro formas ultimately become some of the metrics that you're going to hold yourself to as you get farther into the deal process and certainly into implementation. But it does allow you to test out whether the concept works, again, mathematically. It also helps you begin to test out where the risk, the risk fault lines might be in terms of if you're drifting off course, what does failure mean from a performance perspective, and it can become a truth teller if you handle the planning and forecasting correctly. So, Lance, I know you want to jump in. Please take over the mic.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. And one of the things that we have to also leverage in thinking about the deal thesis as well as the post extraction of value is that in today's market there's a lot of diligence work that's being done by the seller ahead of a transaction. So in terms of the view at which you're coming into a transaction, if you are the buyer in a transaction, it's more likely than not in today's market that there is a team rallying around a seller that includes an investment banker, potentially a sell-side quality of earnings diligence report. There may be an IT assessment that's done. There may be a regulatory assessment that's done. So there's a lot of prepared strategy that's presented to emphasize the value proposition of a seller. As a buyer, the groundwork, or at least the path to success and the path to strategy and value extraction has been presented, and that should tie into the strategy of post-transaction value extraction and enhancement that should be exercised post-transaction. Obviously that's an assessment that has to be made during diligence, through your own diligence, as to the ability of the transaction to deliver on some of those projections and assumptions that have been built into the future state of that entity. So, I know that this page in our presentation reflects some of the strategy and the thesis, but a lot of what we're referring to has already been assessed by a seller, right? Emphasizing their own strategy that could be leveraged and enhanced, right, by the synergistic opportunities that a buyer may bring to the transaction. So, with that, I think, unless, Stephen, you have any further comments on slide 10, I think we could move over and move on to the next slide.
Great. So thanks, Lance. And, moving ahead to the page that's titled Due Diligence Best Practices, what we want to talk about here is I think we all have a sense of what due diligence is, but I want to break it down into components and show, I think we all think of due diligence probably as kicking the tires, making sure the financial statements are correct. But we want to walk through kind of a broader array of risks that we like to investigate and address from a diligence perspective, and talk about why each of these areas creates value, either by de-risking the acquisition or creating better preparation for either day one readiness or integration. And like I said, I think we all, just moving from left to right, I think we all understand financial diligence, and that we're trying to understand if there are any Q of E concerns, any out-of-period revenues or expenses that should be realigned so that we can get a better view of year-over-year, period-over-period financial performance. Even finding things, whether it's in pension assumptions or working capital, that that might be a surprise from the initial perusal of the audited financial statements. But what I think we'll be able to emphasize as we're going through the rest of these areas is that not all the financial surprises really are currently on the balance sheet or currently on the financial statements in terms of debits and credits. A lot of them lurk and reside somewhere else, but haven't formally been addressed in an accounting manner at the point of the transaction. So beyond looking at Q of E, we like to look at tax when you're dealing on the for-profit side. I think trying to lower your tax liabilities is probably obvious. You don't need to talk a whole lot about the math there, but it's a really important aspect of how you structure a deal. Making sure that you have a tax strategy at the beginning, so that you're not inadvertently putting yourself into an adverse position from a tax perspective when it could have been avoided. And even on the not-for-profit side, we include taxes as a really important area of due diligence because, well, generally we will find that most health systems are pretty solid in carrying out their not-for-profit mission. It is possible, and it does happen, that there are aspects of entities being acquired that are not-for-profit, especially as they become more and more distressed, where they may have stepped over the line or in their minds didn't have the luxury of adhering to all the regulations that they needed to related to their not-for-profit status. So understanding those pre-transaction not only allows you to begin to mitigate them or potentially even fully mitigate them before the deal closes, it does allow you to have mitigation strategies in place as you either sign a definitive agreement or at the closing date. Moving into the aqua areas, all those that are labeled under operational, they really have a few underlying themes to them, and you know it's in operations that you really drive whether or not you have a positive bottom line or not, and it's in operations where you're either making capital investments, sooner or later, today or tomorrow, and where you might have put off making investments that were needed for whatever reason, lack of cash because you're trying to make your margins look a little bit better in the short term. Whatever the case, as we go through each of these areas, what I really find from a risk perspective that's valuable is understanding where there are latent liabilities that might be in the form of deferred investments, deferred problems that need to be fixed, or just risks that could have a regulatory nature that either have already gotten off the track or may soon get off the track. So from an operations perspective, if the organization that you're acquiring, if you can understand kind of the soundness of the fundamentals of its operations, efficiencies, throughputs, quality metrics, all of those types of things that you want to make sure that that the metrics that the organization you're acquiring that they track internally kind of match the brand and the expectations that you have of that organization on the surface. Otherwise, you'll end up with surprises that can be diluted. On the technology side, the types of risk can be really, can fall into a number of different buckets. It can fall into different systems that aren't compatible with your own. It can fall into, for whatever reason, lack of investment in infrastructure or maintaining current instances of your applications. It can involve, again, for whatever reason, poor practices either related to disaster recovery planning, et cetera, that as you then take over the entity and the related technology, that you're facing an investment that wasn't expected. To me, that's like a liability. It's something that you have to pay that you weren't expecting to, or you can just think of it as a decrease in the cash line of the balance sheet because you have to spend money that you weren't planning on. Usually when you're driving up the investment significantly on these transactions, the ROI falls off. It certainly is, as you drive up investment, the ROI has been go down, but generally as you're finding these big nuggets in the technology space, it can make the ROI evaporate very quickly and almost entirely. Steve, with your technology background, I'll turn it over to you for a second if you want to add some comments of typical pitfalls or any war stories from transactions that you've been involved in.
Yeah, I'll just throw in my 2 cents worth. We'll talk a little bit further about some other hot spots as we get into things, but I think that there's 2 things that I hear the most, and this is not just in healthcare, but also other industries, especially when a lot of private equity firms will actually get what's called reps and warranties insurance. In other words, just to confirm that everything they've heard is correct. But typically what the financial advisors are asking about and what the insurance companies are asking about that are insuring these deals, so to speak, is they consistently ask me about, has there been any major security breaches that have occurred in the last 1 to 2 years? And then the second item is, do they have the proper controls, whether it is a private company or a public company, do they have the proper controls and capabilities internally to be able to support that organization? So that's one area. The whole security and controls is really important. The other thing that's interesting on the IT side that's popped up in this is they want to know what kind of custom developed software has been created using any kind of open source code or any kind of open source products that are out there. That's a very interesting question and a fascinating question, especially with companies that may have, I'm thinking some medical devices that may end up with any kind of specialized software that is monitoring or is really enhances the product itself. And that typically is not commercial off-the-shelf products. It is something that's developed custom-wise. And those questions come up a lot by, again, both private equity companies as well as strategic buyers, if you will, that are looking at these kinds of transactions. Let me add one other thing here on this that I think it's important to note that I've seen. This another kind of war story, if you will. One of the private equity firms that I've worked with in the past and we have all these operational or commercial diligence kind of areas, but this one organization always asks about 2 things. One is the safety of the workers. So this is in a lot of cases for manufacturing, but has there been any safety issues regardless of whether it's been at a manufacturing facility or just on site? Do they have issues with that? And that can be a deal breaker for one of our clients. And the other issue is, and this is especially true in I guess in manufacturing more than anything else, is the whole concept of how does it affect the environment? How is the organization committed to sustainability? And that ends up being a deal breaker in a lot of cases. Those 2 items for some of the clients that I've worked with, where the financials could be great, it could be a great thing to make a lot of money on, but if those 2 areas are problematic, they will walk away from the deal very quickly. So you can't say enough about operations and the whole commercial diligence area across these different points. So
yeah, I've seen deals come together, fall apart just as organizations begin to evaluate their different EMR platforms. One's on Cerner, one's on Epic, or whatever the case may be, and the terms of the EMR agreements extend out far enough that either getting out of them becomes too costly, or the conversion costs and the investment costs are just too much for the acquirer. And usually the seller can't afford to move from an old to a new EMR, and often that's a driver for why they're considering putting themselves on the block. So whether it's cyber, whether it's applications, other hidden investments that haven't been made, technology is an area that has a high degree of risk. Moving ahead to regulatory and quality, recently participated in an acquisition in which the target, this came out through due diligence, was in the midst of a number of internal investigations into anti-kickback. Anti-kickback led to some private inurement. There are stark violations that kind of just hit the trifecta with what I would call some small town wheeling and dealing, but nonetheless, it's problem with various federal laws and regulations. So whether it's understanding the robustness of the Target's compliance program, the compliance matters, and if it's an organization of any size, they will have some understanding the complexity and the degree of compliance challenges that they have on their plate. All of those things are again, they're kind of these latent liabilities that are going to follow the provider number to the acquirer, and really need to be understood ahead of time to begin to to really allow for the mitigation of the risk and the protection of the value. And then lastly, on this, I guess the last two areas I'll mention on this page related to human capital. People obviously are very important in any healthcare organization. How they're paid, what benefits they receive, are there unions or non-unions? All of those different types of attributes that go into how the employee base is organized, their attitudes about employment, et cetera, become an important piece of the equation. And it's also important to understand too, there's generally the executive teams in any organization will have transfer of ownership clauses that sometimes result in modest payments to the executives, and sometimes result in much larger payments to executives that just because the transaction occurs will result in either a small to a really meaningful and material outlay of cash that should be known to the buyer ahead of time. And then also on the people side, it's understanding culture, how decisions get made, how organizations function, how the cultures of two organizations may or may not come together. It's not just the mission statement, but it's the kind of the day-to-day values and behaviors that dictate how people do their work. How well those fit together as organizations come together are a key value driver. They're somewhat hidden in plain sight. We all know that they're important, but they are, and even when you know what they are and you're working to address them, it can take time to overcome whatever pride or ways of doing things the target might have as they become part of a larger organization. So putting all those together from a due diligence perspective provides a very good sense of the overall risks that are lurking in a transaction. These also provide the ingredients for understanding, for more fully understanding the value drivers, and it provides a lot of really rich information that feeds into the integration planning process. And so as we move ahead from due diligence to thinking about integration planning, I'd like to skip ahead a page. We can move to I'll turn it over to Steve Sparks to talk about day one readiness.
Okay, great. Thank you. Oops, let me jump ahead here. I jumped to the wrong slide. Let me get to this. All right, day one readiness. Just to go back real quickly to our transaction life cycle that we had discussed earlier in the discussion here. As you go through that overall life cycle from identifying targets to pre-LOI to negotiating deal and getting to the signing of a purchase agreement or definitive agreement or a sales agreement to buy something, you now get to the point where the transaction actually closes. Someone hands you the keys to the property and say, it's yours. And so this concept of a close or closing, another term that's used a lot in merger and acquisition is day one. And many of the folks on this presentation probably are aware of that. Just keep in mind that the whole concept of day one says, all right, now I own it. I own the facility. I own the people. I own the systems. Everything is now, part of our organization. What do we do next? And I think that the concept of day one has to do more with what are the things that I need to do, what are the absolute requirements or must-haves that I have to do prior to actually taking the keys from the seller. And this slide really touches on kind of a laundry list of items based on the transaction or based on the kind of acquisition you made. And these can hold true for whether I'm buying, let's say, a standalone practice or a standalone health system or hospital or whatever. That has a series of day one requirements there. Also, these requirements come into play if I'm buying something, or let's say I'm buying a medical center outside of or pulling it out of a university environment. I'm carving it out, or I'm actually separating it from another entity. There's a whole series of day one requirements there as well. And keep in mind, the concept here is not about, well, I'm turning everything off and I'm creating something new on day one. No, it's all about what are the absolute mandatory things that I need to do in order to take the keys and to run the operations. And again, it's very different based on the kind of acquisition you make, whether it's a standalone acquisition, carving it out from another company, or in some cases, maybe I'm actually it's going public for whatever reason. I'm spinning it off, and that tends to happen a lot in the medical products and the pharma business. They will spin off organizations. And so if you look at this slide, that there's some things that are absolutely required to make sure when I get the keys to that property or to that company that I can actually make things happen. And there's operating processes or business or clinical processes that may need to be changed. But in a lot of cases, a lot of these processes revolve around making sure that I can actually pay my employees. I can make sure that my all the benefits are still going to work on that day one. That doesn't seem like it's a lot, but there's a lot of things that go on in the background to make sure that occurs. From a business continuity perspective, it's all about how do I keep the business running. So making sure that whatever I have to do from maybe a clinical perspective, are there certain processes that I'm following in my healthcare organization that I've got to make sure that they're working when I get the actual company itself. I mean, those are going to be key. Are there certain regulatory issues that are going to be required, or maybe from a physician perspective that credentialing has to occur from that standpoint, that I do the proper thing there. The other thing is, are there any specific capital requirements that are necessary on day one? I think Stephen mentioned working capital. I mean, that is a very big deal in a lot of these acquisitions. Is there working capital available on day one that now I have access to be able to execute and manage on the property itself? So those kinds of things pop up. From an IT perspective in day one, some of the bigger issues that pop up, especially even on a standalone acquisition, and this may sound fairly basic, but email tends to come up as a big issue. In a carve-out situation, you're going to have to separate, if you will, let's say, patients that may be part of the old system, that are health system that's staying with the seller, but there are going to be patients that are going to come over into the new environment. And you have to figure out, how do I separate that data? How do I separate the information from the seller and the buyer? Those tend to come up, and understanding what those are, and are there specific things that I need to do on day one to make sure that works correctly? I know in the health environment, if for whatever reason there's going to be a change of how the brand looks. Let's say I'm buying something from the seller and I'm going to change the brand. Instead of X University, it's going to be a new company, and there's branding associated with that. That tends to be a day one requirement, and there's regulatory issues that pop up as a result of that. So all those things have system implications as well, in terms of changing things like addresses, changing the names of the companies, what goes on invoices, what goes on any kind of communication that goes out to patients. All those things may be necessary as part of a day one activity. things that might be required, or I should say, not so much required for day one, but something to keep in mind that is important, but maybe is a day 30 or day 60 kind of issue. A lot of those things tend to be around communications to employees, and to employees both on the companies that are being acquired, as well as the employees of the people that are within the buyer organization. A good example where this can come into play is, and we see this a great deal in the healthcare environment, and I think Stephen alluded to this as well, there's a lot of changing of hands of health systems and hospital systems, and in some cases, competitors are coming together in the transaction. I mean, we've seen that in more than one case, and so you have two health systems that might have been fierce competitors, now they're coming together. And the communications on that can't be ignored. The communications to the employees, communications to the physicians and clinical staff, but also the communications back to the patients as well. All those things are important that are, I would say, are should-haves, if you will, within that first 30, 60, 90-day period. And you're going to have also some communications early on in terms of just being able to do that. So I think there's a lot of things to just keep in mind in that day one category. But again, that's just to get to the point where I can now operate the facility. I think the next stage from an IT perspective is, what are all the different system issues that I'm going to be facing moving ahead? And if you look on the next slide, I call this integration hotspots. And I look at this as something, you're not necessarily looking at some of these hotspots just initially, or not after day one, but you're looking at them initially in the transaction at a starting point. I think for us, I think there's a whole series of areas that touch on IT, and I think that's what makes IT both interesting as well as complex. Every single business process, clinical process, and really how the operations works at facilities, IT is touching all of it. So you can't necessarily avoid not looking at this, not looking at all these different areas as part of a transaction. And I'm kind of running out of time here, so I'm going to be quickly going through this. Let me just identify a couple of things I think that's important. In the pure IT area, we mentioned data acquisition, data separation, if you will. That becomes very clear and very important from a carve out or a buy. You're pulling something out or separating out an organization. Clinical operations, and Stephen had mentioned this earlier. We've seen some healthcare systems that our client is looking at, and they will have two EMRs, or they may in fact have two financial systems as well. And how do you separate those systems out? How do you actually get those systems to think through, which one is going to be worthwhile kind of post-acquisition? So those kinds of things are part of the discussion that goes on. Culture and organization design, this gets back to that communication mechanism, and I think it's important to keep in mind from an IT perspective, the IT people are very concerned about what their position is when a new acquisition occurs and how is it going to affect them, and I think those are definitely things to review and consider, as part of these kinds of transactions. So you can see all of these as items to not only look at during the diligence process, but they also fall all the way into the integration area. The next couple of slides are really some examples of things that we've done at other clients, and they're a fair amount of detail, and I'm not going to go through this in a tremendous amount of time here, just because of our how much is left in our presentation time. We wanted to address some questions, but I think the point here on the next slide, which is really slide 14, and I call this a very good consulting slide, is that there's a lot of areas that are required for an integration project. And we touch on all aspects of the business, not just, the infrastructure or the applications architecture and what it looks like. IT is enabling every single one of these functions, and understanding what those functions are doing, what applications are enabling them, are going to be important. And then how are you going to either separate them from a company and then integrate, or how are you going to integrate them together to get the most synergies out of the acquisition itself? So this is an example of that team structure. This is a fairly robust structure. These are probably for clearly very, very complex integration projects, because they touch on all these different areas. Just one other comment I would like to make. It says Integration Management Office. The whole concept here is not so much you're not putting another level of overhead. You're trying to really understand what exactly all these different functions are doing, because there's a lot of coordination that happens as a result of it. One other slide I wanted to hit on, and this is slide number 15, our next slide, proposed decision framework. This is almost like a filter or a lens that we look at across all these different areas whenever we're doing an integration, strategy, clinical, governance, etc. And you want to determine, of these areas, what are the systems that are enabling them, discovering what those systems are. Are there areas where you could actually pull those, you can actually see how you can combine those systems together in some form or fashion, perhaps reduce the footprint of IT across two companies? That's the real key behind this kind of decision framework. And then what's the things that we need to deploy? How do we need to put those things out in the environment to make them work appropriately? So think of this as a filter. Think of this as a lens as you go through an integration approach. And again, we've used this on other clients, and we've been effective because we've been able to really have our clients think through, why do they need to make these changes? Why do they need to have these kind of applications? If you have 2 or 3 applications doing the same thing, why do you have 3? Shouldn't you just have 1? And this is the kind of process that we can follow to go through that. Stephen, I'm going to just jump into the next slide, which is on lessons learned, and I think maybe all 3 of us can kind of touch on this. And this is just a broader integration concept here, but I think Stephen touched on a few of these in some of the earlier slides. But I think the takeaway here is understanding how, and let me change my slide ahead here, on lessons learned, is that a lot of these activities, a lot of the things that you have to think through as you go through an integration are really, it starts really from the time you actually started the diligence process or started the acquisition process. What is the intent behind the acquisition itself? And as we touched on that before, if you don't have a good process or a good concept of why you're doing the integration or the acquisition in the first place, it may not necessarily achieve the results that you were hoping for. And that's pretty straightforward. That sounds almost obvious, but in a lot of cases, sometimes our clients haven't necessarily thought that through enough, and we have to take a step back with them and say, what are you trying to do with this? What makes the most sense around it? And then going through that process of alignment, both from a business standpoint, executive, and then you get into the actual execution of how things actually work. So I'm going to pause there. And Stephen or Lance, did you want to jump in and provide any other thoughts or comments around this?
Yeah, I thought I'd just try to jump ahead to some questions that were submitted, given that we only have 7 minutes left. One of the questions that came in said, what is making this a seller's market? And Lance, I'd be curious if you have insights or comments on that.
Yeah, I think, Stephen, it goes back to, I think, just the supply and demand. Healthcare transactions for at least the last 7 years have been, in great desire. And a lot of private capital has done a tremendous job at consolidating, for-profit healthcare providers, right? It's just every day you read a headline. There's trillions of dollars in private equity capital that's effectively accessing and consolidating, the for-profit market. So it's really a function of those providers that are willing to transact becoming fewer, while the number of private equity funds that are focused in healthcare sector are growing. So that's driving up prices and making it a seller's market right now. The access to capital, buyers willing to pay rich multiples, sellers realizing and becoming more educated through the process and consulting with their network. And it doesn't cease to amaze me how many times, in the transactions I'm working on, that the clients that we serve in, the sellers, because we're doing a lot of sell-side activity, that they are very educated and very knowledgeable about the financial investment in the sector. A lot of them have contacts in the private equity or private capital space, have relationships with investment bankers, and are very knowledgeable about running a transaction. So they've evolved over time. They've become more sophisticated, and they're more aware of what they're looking for, and that's driving them with more ammunition and more knowledge to drive value for themselves. So that's really in a nutshell why it's become a seller's market.
And we also had a question about just behavioral health and what the dynamics are there. And Lance, I think you've done so many of those transactions that you probably have some insight to offer on that question as well.
Yeah, and I think behavioral is definitely a hot sector. And I think a consequence of that is level of consolidation, and generally speaking, it's also the level of reimbursement that gets covered for behavioral treatment. So there are opportunities growing in the behavioral space. In terms of behavioral, it's broken down to a number of different types of behavioral. Obviously, you get the inpatient type of behavioral setting. You also get the outpatient. We've seen a number of autism transactions, and that's been a popular sector for a couple of years now, and that's primarily driven by the demand for those services and also the reimbursement trends. I think another sector that we've seen some recent activity in is on the outpatient, either in-home behavioral services. It's also doing family counseling, eating disorder, drug abuse, psychological testing, and these are like a combination of services that are provided, as an outpatient service, and really growing in popularity.
All right. Well, we're at 3 minutes before the bottom of the hour, so I think that I do want to say on behalf of Grant Thornton and our panel that we appreciate all of you joining today. We appreciate the questions that were submitted, and I have gotten to all of them. I hope that the information we presented is useful and gives you some insight as you look ahead to the challenges that you have in your day-to-day jobs, in your careers. But all of that said, just let me say one more time, thank you for joining and spending 90 minutes of your afternoon with us. We enjoyed having the opportunity to present. We hope this is useful for all of you on the phone. Thank you.
Are you sure the weather is good for Galveston?
We have reached the conclusion of today's webinar presentation. I would like to thank the speakers for presenting and Grant Thornton for sponsoring this very timely presentation. We hope you have found the presentation informative. Please remember to complete the online evaluation within 2 days after the webinar. Your feedback is important and helps plan future programs. If you have further questions about this webinar, you may email them to HFMA's Resource Center at resourcecenter@hfma.org. Our Resource Center staff will assist with questions not answered during this webinar. Be sure to sign up for upcoming webinars via the HFMA website at hfma.org. Thank you for your participation and have a great day.